Oh, Jennifer just told me there's a phone left in a car.
Maybe she went here.
Person got shuttled over from the golf course and left the phone in their car. So it'll be up here. Okay, if it rings, we'll know somebody's calling. But thank you for coming today. We've got some upcoming events I'd like to tell you about. Tuesday, March the 11th, we have a presentation. It's through the Evansville Bar Association. And it's a program that's titled Fearless Lawyers, Unpopular Clients, and the Concept of Justice. We'll have lunch that day. Doors open at 11:30. Lunch is at noon. The program starts at 12:30. We have Dr. Rubin from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He's going to be here as a speaker live. We also have a gentleman, a retired public defender from New York. His name is Douglas Morris. He will be here by Zoom. And also a gentleman from Berlin, Dr. Ting Biao, and he will be telling us a lot of the things that are happening in China and worldwide with civilian rights, lawyers' rights. So please come if you can. The program should end at 4:30. And then upcoming, we've got the 20th of March, we've got Dr. Pete Blanc. He's going to talk about the Guadalcanal campaign. And then on the 3rd of April, Nils Johansson is going to talk about the Norwegian resistance, and we'll also have a veterans group to talk about the 40 and 8. So today, before we start the prayer, just one thing about making reservations. Please don't assume that if you've been coming on a regular basis that you have a reservation. You need to call and confirm that with the museum, and you need to get that call in by the end of day on Monday, the Monday before the program. And if you can't make it after you've made the reservation, please call as soon as you know you can't make it. So we're going to begin with prayer today. And Jack Buttram is going to lead us in prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you. Would you bow with me in an attitude of prayer? Father God, as we come to you in prayer this March of 25, we thank you for this day and for allowing us to be a part of it. I listened to a World War II song the other day. It went something like this. We are coming in on a wing and a prayer. With one motor gone, we still carry on. And we come in on a wing and a prayer. Help us, Father, to truly appreciate those who we call our greatest generation. Here is an example of the bravery displayed by so many in that war. A whole crew, and they limp in with a wing and a prayer. We love this great country of ours and are forever grateful to those who kept us the land of the free and the home of the brave. And now we ask your blessing on this meal and offer our thanks to those who made our meeting possible. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Would you lead with me as we do our pledge to our flag and our country?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Tom, give us a
song that you're going to sing.
Please feel free to join me in singing our national anthem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose white stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Tom. One other note before Kevin Reid comes up to speak. The donations that you provided today are helping to fund the digitalization of the Ken Wilson collection. And that project, once we get going, which will be sometime later this spring, early summer, it will take about a year to complete the work. Thank you for your donations. So our speaker today, Kevin Reid, has a master's degree from Purdue University in military history, focused on tactics, battles in the 20th century. Kevin was an instructor for 30 years at the Kentucky Community and Technical College. He was also a librarian there. He's written a number of articles talking about military history, battles, and that kind of thing. Professor Reid also is a World War I and World War II reenactor. He's also a volunteer at the Indiana Military Museum, and also a volunteer here at the Evansville Wartime Museum. And one other thing, he's been a docent at the Patton Museum of History in Fort Knox. So Kevin, please present.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'm going to check my controls here. So we're talking about Flak in World War II. And I think this is probably a pretty good starting photograph, just so you can get a chance to see what flak looks like. So in that photograph, all those little brown and black sort of circles are explosions in the air. And the bombers have to fly through all that to actually get to their targets. So we're going to talk some about the technology of flak, how it works, a little bit of the history. I'm going to make an apology. A lot of this is going to be focused on German stuff. So if I try to talk about German flak versus American or British or Russian, I could spend about 10 hours and put you all to sleep. Probably don't want all that. So pretty much everything we talk about in the way the Germans had to evolve their flak forces and how effective they were is going to impact everybody else as well. I also would like to put in a plug for the Indiana Military Museum up in Vincennes. The judge there was nice enough to loan to me for this presentation the poster you see there, which is a nice World War II piece trying to gin up popular support for the war. But it gives you a good image of what an anti-aircraft gun would look like, and you'll notice the searchlight. So you begin to see that flak isn't just a single cannon, it's actually a very comprehensive system where you have lots of parts working together to try to stop the incoming aircraft. Also, as I talk about some of the flak guns that were used, the 20mm German anti-aircraft gun, the famous German 88mm anti-aircraft, and so forth, a lot of those you can see examples of if you go up to Vincennes. So it's a really great place to do a field trip if you want to see the physical realities of the flak guns. So then let's get to it and talk about what flak is. And hopefully if I do this right, we'll have time to answer some questions along the way. So first of all, why do we call it flak? It's such an awkward word. Flak is actually a contraction from a German word, Flugzeugabwehrkanone, F-L-K. And it's pronounced Flak because it's easier to say it that way. The Germans have a hard time making new words, so they just add a whole bunch of words together. And all that means is airplane defense cannon. So Flak is literally what the cannons fire. And everybody adopted it. In World War I, the British used to refer to it as Archie. During the interwar years, the British called it Ak-Ak. Some people call it Flak. It's been called a lot of things. I'm going to use it as a sort of generic term. And if you do the contractions the way the Germans did, they capitalized the word cannon. That's why there's a capital at the end of it. So, what does it come from? How did it work, etc.? Everybody thinks about World War I as the first war in which aircraft were used. Actually, the first war that saw aircraft actually being used and fired at was the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And part of that war, the Germans actually encircled and besieged the city of Paris. And the way Paris got a couple of politicians out and sent communications in and some medical equipment was by balloons. And of course, you don't want the siege to be broken, so the Germans had to try to shoot with their artillery pieces at balloons as they flew by. So their first dedicated anti-aircraft weapon was the BAK, the Balloon Abwehrkanone. And what they found is, you'd think if you shot a hole in a balloon, it would fall out of the sky. But you know, those balloons are pretty big. And the holes that go through the fabric aren't very big because there's nothing to explode the shell. So the shell just passes right through it, and you have two little holes, and the air sort of seeps out of it. But, you know, if the balloon is rising or going down, either one, it goes fairly quickly. And so there were a number of balloons that came back with lots of holes in them, but they never fell out of the sky. So it was a wash, and nobody really used it. Airplanes and flak came into their own during World War I, and just sort of for I guess for a roadmap for you all, the very first airplane, heavier than air airplane that flew was at Kitty Hawk in 1903. So if you think about World War I starting in 1914, that's what, 13 years, or 11 years, excuse me, after the airplane was introduced. Nobody had really thought very effectively as to what airplanes could do. They thought, well, you could use airplanes for reconnaissance and they can look and see what's going on. So you had some people did that, and let's go ahead and proceed here. And they also used them sometimes during World War I to spot where their artillery rounds are landing or to do observation. But the airplanes were so small. I mean, the very first airplane was using a lawnmower engine. So they're not exactly really stable in flight. They don't fly real high and so forth. And what you're going to see in both World War I and World War II is, in order to survive and to win in a war, both sides get into an arms race. And both sides use lots of really clever people and engineers to create bigger and better machines. So in World War I, the first airplanes, like I said, basically had lawnmower engines, and they flew at about 80 miles an hour, and they were 300, 400 feet up to maybe a couple thousand feet in altitude. They weren't very big. By the end of the war, they had planes that could fly 140, 150 miles an hour. They had multi-engine planes that could drop bombs. They had specialized ground attack planes. So you can see lots of evolution. And of course, while you're evolving there, the guys on the ground are trying to evolve too. So the very first air combat was with pilots shooting at one another with pistols and shotguns, because that was all they could carry. Then you started having planes with multiple people in the planes, because you had bigger engines, and that way you could mount a machine gun on them and they could shoot at one another. And pretty soon it was realized that if I can use my planes to adjust my artillery fire so it lands on the enemy, they can do the same thing to us. So now we've got to shoot down those planes. And so the very first anti-aircraft weapons, or flak weapons, actually used machine guns. So this is a sort of standard 30 caliber round. It doesn't look all that powerful. And hopefully if you're shooting it out of a machine gun, there'll be enough holes where you either kill the crew or put enough holes in the airplane engine where it falls out of the sky. Doesn't do a lot of damage. So the first upgrade is to go to heavier machine guns like the US 50 caliber. It was designed at the end of World War I, and it's going to be heavily used during World War II. But again, you can see this is a bit bigger ammunition than the standard 30 caliber. which means it's going a lot faster, it has more punch, it's heavier, it does more damage when it hits things. But that still doesn't do that much. So everybody started using what they called quick fire cannons. So short little digression about artillery. In the Civil War, you had to put the gunpowder down the barrel and you had to ram it, and every time you fired the gun, jump backwards. The French in the 1880s and 1890s introduced what was called the 75 millimeter cannon. And it had a recoil mechanism that combined a spring and hydraulic fluid. When you fired, the hydraulic fluid would be compressed, the spring would absorb the recoil, and it would drive the barrel back forward again. So you could have a field piece set in one place, the barrel would recoil like this, but it would stay in place. So you didn't have to keep moving the cannon around. And once you add that to fixed ammunition, then you could have the French 75 firing a shell out of this. And all you have to do is put the cannon in. When it fires, it ejects the shell, you put another one in, and you can have the big rate of fire chain. So in the Civil War, cannon, you'd fire one round every 3 or 4 minutes. With French 75, you could do 14 to 18 rounds per minute. Think about that for a second. Now, the next thing they also introduced with those was a fuse that would explode after a certain amount of time. And you could actually set each fuse so when they exploded, they would be hopefully near the target, and as they exploded, you get lots of shrapnel flying around. When we talk about flak, the real danger is from shrapnel. Nice, heavy pieces of steel which have shattered off of the gun or off of the projectile. And now you can, after the talk is over with, you can come and look at it and pick it up, and you can get a feel for what shrapnel would be like. But imagine this flying through the air, going through the paper skin of an airplane, or in World War II, through the aluminum skin of an airplane. The aluminum isn't going to slow it down any, and the only thing that's really there is the soft, squishy things inside the airplane to stop them. So you can see how dangerous that would be. What they did in World War I is they would mount the cannons on turntables, sometimes on trucks, so you can fire very quickly up in the air. The problem is, of course, hitting your target, because while it's simple enough to look at an airplane, there are a lot of realities about flight. So how high up is the target? How much time does the shell have to be in flight so that it explodes where the target is? And how do I track that target as it moves? Now this is kind of one of those mathematical problems. In World War I, if you had, for example, a Sopwith Camel, it flew at 116 miles an hour. Say it's at 9,000 feet, takes about 10 seconds, 11 seconds to get your shell from the ground up to about 9,000 feet. Okay, how far does that airplane travel? Well, let's see. According to the figures, 680 feet. So if I aim at where that plane is, by the time the shell gets there, the plane's over here. Think about that for a second and how you're going to try to coordinate all that. So what happens is, in order for artillery to be effective against the airplanes, you have to have a crew that can load and fire the gun very quickly. You also has to have somebody who sets the timing on the fuse so it goes off the right altitude. Now, we've made it very simple here, and we're just talking about speed. The other thing, I know there's plenty of pilots in this group, that when you talk about different altitudes and different temperatures, you get warm air and cool air, which is why your airplanes sometimes go up and down when you're flying and you think you're level. Well, if I think I'm level and I'm firing at 9,000 feet and you hear an updraft, the airplane may go up to 9,100 feet or 9,200 feet or 9,300 feet. With the 75 millimeter, they did some tests after the war, and the average burst radius of 75, and then later on in World War II, the German 88, is about 19 feet. So if a shrapnel goes off for about 19 feet in a circle around that, you're going to get fragments flying out. From one of these, they counted up to about 1,000 fragments coming per shell. Now imagine you've got to figure out where the plane's going, how far it's going, how fast it's going, what altitude it's at, set the time, and the shell goes off, and you've got to do that for 20 rounds a minute. Does it sound a little complicated? Well, the reality of World War I was that by the end of the war, when the Germans did analysis of how effective their flak was, they found it took, on average, about 5,040 shells for every airplane shot down. Let me say that again, 5,040 shells for every plane shot down. Now, what we're going to find when we get to World War II is the airplanes fly higher, they fly faster, so it's going to be even more difficult for that. Other issues is the unaided eye has a very hard time finding differences in range, so that makes it a little bit difficult. And no such thing as radar existed yet. So how do you know where the airplanes are? They used what was called sound detection, where you would have instruments that would, well, they'd act like speaking trumpets. You know in the movies where they hold the little trumpet next to your ear? That big trumpet actually kind of focuses sound, so it's easier to hear things from further away. So that's an example of a World War II sound detector. And what you see on that is each of these is basically a big earpiece where that's focusing all the sounds, and you see these guys are wearing the headphones so they can actually hear things. And in World War I, it was even more primitive than that. But imagine using that to hear the sound of incoming airplanes, and then you warn the flak crews that the airplanes are closing in. Well, how much real warning do you have? Maybe a couple of seconds? So you have to have your guns loaded up and ready and in the right location, because otherwise, as the planes are flying in, they may overfly you before you can actually get your gun shooting, which is why they started with machine guns, because they're pretty easy to move. But you're going to have to come up with better technology. So what you're going to find is during the interwar years, you have a whole lot of developments going on, one of which included what was called a range finder and a direction calculator. So on that range finder, what we have is this big long bar has a piece of optical glass here, and at the other end you can't see because the guy's head is in the way. And what those are two lenses to look into the sky that are a known distance apart. And what you can do is use a focuser. When you are in focus, the angle of the two pieces actually focus on your target. And now you can use trigonometry to figure the distance between you and your target based on the known length of the arms of that rangefinder. Now, does that look very mobile? So, first thing is, one of the things that everybody decided to do, the Germans as well, is you would always organize your anti-aircraft guns in what was called a battery, which was usually 4 to 6 guns. And somewhere near that battery, you would have a setup like this, where somebody would call out the range to the battery commander, and then that battery commander would read that out to all the gunners, so all the gunners would know how to set their fuses. Now, first thing is you want the range, and you also want somebody trying to figure out the distance. Now, if you wonder why radar was so important in World War II, if you have a machine that with the early World War II radar sets could go out to 100 miles, you had a whole lot more warning than you had with that sound detector we were looking at just a minute ago. So you can begin to see how technology is a really major part of the flak game. Another part of the flak game is introducing different weapons that were built on what the Germans had used and what other countries had used in World War I. During World War I, the Germans had designed an automatic 20mm machine gun, which was called the Becker gun. And when it was mounted on the ground, it became an anti-aircraft gun. So, one of those things, everybody talks about different sizes of calibers, and calibers is kind of a cheater problem for people. When we talk about 20mm, all that is the diameter of the shell, which is about 3/4 of an inch. All right, because there's 25.4 millimeters to an inch. So, but you can have different size cartridges. So in World War II, we're going to see the Americans use this 20mm cannon shell on our Orkland guns. The Germans use this 20mm cannon shell for the anti-aircraft guns. And the first thing you'll notice is they're the same diameter, but you know this is a bigger projectile and it's a whole lot more powder in it. So saying something's 20mm or 88mm or 3 inches or whatever, only tells you the diameter. The important thing is how it's loaded and how much power it has. So the reason they went to 20 millimeter is a 20 millimeter shell is big enough where you can put an explosive charge in it, and that will actually explode when it hits the target, assuming your target's a little bit more solid than, say, a balloon. Now, if you want to see what that looks like, there were two major developments during the interwar years for light and medium guns. One was the 20 millimeter, the other was the 40 millimeter, which sometimes is referred to as a Boffer. We have a cutaway shell, and you can see there's a fuse here with a primer here, and then your explosive compound. And when it explodes, then your shrapnel is going to go flying around. And obviously, this is going to be smaller pieces than this, which came off of a bigger shell. But again, smaller pieces, there aren't going to be as many of them, and you're going to have to fire a lot of them. And for it to work, you either have to have a timer on it, or it actually has to impact the point. So in the interwar years, lots of guns used either 20 millimeter or 37/40 millimeter. Now, when we talk about Evansville, for example, as you've looked through the museum, if you looked at the Serval case, there were a bunch of 37 millimeter shell casings we talked about. They were made by the millions, literally, because the 37 millimeter cannons used during World War II cycled at about 120 to 180 rounds a minute. So what you have is a slow firing machine gun. Interestingly enough, the 20 millimeter Orkland, which was made in Switzerland, and the 40 millimeter Bofors, which was made in Sweden, were both derived from German designs. And in fact, the Bofors gun, the Bofors company was partially owned by Krupp after World War I. So we're seeing a lot of German technology used. Countries like the United States and Britain paid rights to Bofors and to Oerlikon to build ammunition and to build the guns to their components. So we actually had to pay rights for every one of the guns that we manufactured to both Sweden and Switzerland, which were both neutral states. But interestingly enough, like I said, their guns were based off of German designs. The other big design that came out of World War I was the 88 millimeter German anti-aircraft gun. So you've got some American machine guns that are being used in this, and those are 50 caliber machine guns with a water-cooled jacket around them so that the gun doesn't overheat when they're firing. But here's a German 88 millimeter cannon. You'll notice it's a pretty big operation that we're looking at here. So you've got the gun here and a crew of 8 to 12 men. Now this is actually a fixed position, so they've dug a hole in the ground and they've built basically wooden abutments to keep the dirt out. And then in each of the corners, they have storage for ammunition. Now this gun fires 18 to 20 rounds a minute, depending on how fast it goes. If I did my mathematics on that, that's about 60 rounds right there. So it's about 3 minutes worth of fire in just that one bin of ammunition alone. You'll also notice that this is part of a battery. So there's another gun here, another gun here, another gun here, here, and so forth. So you got 6 guns all together. So what they've done is they've gotten a big open field and they're all working together, and somewhere probably in this area, you'd have your rangefinder and direction finder. So notice how much more complex the stuff gets. Now, how big is the 88? This is an 88 millimeter shell case. So it's got a fair amount of powder, as you can suspect. And this is an 88 millimeter Flak projectile. Weighs a mere 20 pounds. And you'll notice it's got a fuse on the end. And then inside is where you'd have your explosive compound. Not nearly as much explosive compound as you saw in that. Why? Another one of those physics issues. The faster a projectile goes, the straighter it fires and the higher it goes. However, really fast acceleration sometimes ignites explosives. So your explosive content has to be something that doesn't explode when you fire the shell. And one of the things to protect it is a thicker wall, which is why it doesn't have a big bursting charge. For this 20-pound shell, you get about 1.7 pounds of explosive, and the rest is just steel that's going to turn into shrapnel. If you're part of the gun crew, you're actually firing. The reason there's so many of them is you have a bunch of guys working together to fire the shells. So in this, we've got 2 guys alone that are doing fuse setting. So what they're doing is this little box is hooked to a gauge up here. That gunner sets a tool that will actually turn and lock the fuse to a certain amount of time. Most of the original German flak guns, and the Americans and the British too, were fused specifically for an amount of time in the air. So my World War I example, if you're firing up to 10,000 feet, it takes you 10 seconds to get up there. So maybe you set your fuse for 10 seconds, or maybe it's 10.0005 seconds, so it's a little higher when it explodes. If everybody fires at exactly the same distance, and the airplane goes up or down, and you're not within your 18 feet, are you going to have damage? So what happens is your battery commander is going to command the people to set the fuses, and those little sockets that you see, the fuses have already been put in the shells. They sit down in the nose down like this, and they turn until it clicks. And this guy sets up how it clicks. Now you have 6 or 8 guys that are just handing shells to these 2 guys. They set the fuse, and then they hand it to the gunner or to the loader. The loader then puts it in the gun, and when it fires, the empty case is automatically ejected. So there's a guy standing there ready to shove the round in. Each of these, by the time you add the shell to the powder and the brass and so forth, weighs about 30 pounds. So imagine doing the work on that. And keep in mind just how much physical work that is. And as the war goes on and these aren't doing enough damage, what you're going to see in World War II is the evolution from 88 millimeter shells to what are called 105 millimeter shells, which is basically a 4-inch diameter, to a 5-inch diameter, which is 128 millimeter shells. So they're getting bigger and bigger diameters, heavier and heavier shells, and higher velocity. Now, for those of you that may have gone through one of my lectures earlier when I talked about anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft guns were really good for anti-tank use because you're firing at a very high velocity, which means they tend to penetrate the steel better. So that's why the 88 was used so heavily in both anti-aircraft use and anti-aircraft use. Now, think about that and keep that in mind, because as the war goes on and the Germans run into more and more bad guys that have tanks like the T-34 or the Shermans or whatever, more and more 88s are going to have to be used in a ground role. And how many 88s can Germany produce? So that's part of the issue too. Okay. Now, one of the big innovations during the 1930s is the introduction of radar. So let's go back here a little bit. And we've got radar research that I have mentioned here. The British were the first officially to get radar working as a technology. And a lot of people think that radar was designed at first to be radar. This is the fun part of history. The original research for the radar was done by Robert Watson Watt when somebody in the Defense Department said, what we need to do is we need to find a death ray. And so I want you to figure out how a death ray would work. And for our death ray, what we want to do is point it at enemy airplanes, and we want to figure out how much energy it will take to take 3 quarts of water and raise it to 106 degrees or higher. That 3 quarts of water is about the amount of water and fluid that the average body has. So what you want to do is fire your death ray and get people's blood to boil so they collapse and stop flying when the plane falls out of the sky. So Robert Watson says, okay, you're paying me for this. He does a couple of mathematical formulas and figures out that in order to do that, you need to have the power supply of 3 days in London in order to kill one person, and the death ray doesn't work. However, in World War I, he noticed when there were precipitation coming in, you'd actually get radio waves bouncing off the precipitation. And if that worked, you might be able to use radio waves to find distant resources. And so he starts designing a radar. Now, everybody focuses on Robert Watson Watt, and he did a great job. But you'll notice that I have listed there, the Germans were also doing radar research, the Americans, the Russians, the Japanese, the Italians. So radar is not just a British thing. What the British did is Watson Watt said, okay, we can use these experiments and find out what kind of radio waves we need to send into the sky to get reflections back. And he uses really long wavelengths. And what that was designed for is what he called the chain home system. And that word system is important. You will have radar towers across England. And each of those towers, when they get resistance to things, they can actually compare the distance between them to see if something is moving in the air, like airplanes would, and they would give you warning. The British then also did some experiments to see how well they could identify incoming airplanes, and what they found was that it's nice to know what the airplanes are doing, but how do you make that useful? The British Royal Air Force worked with Watson Watt to not only work on detecting airplanes, but how you can convert that information into something useful for their air defenses. What they did is they had a whole series of these chain home radar towers set on the English coast. And then they had telephone lines from there to a central headquarters. Ultimately, it's going to be located in London. But in the central headquarters, all the information comes in, and then once they say, oh, there's airplanes coming, then they can call on the telephone to an airfield and scramble fighter planes to get over wherever the bombers are headed. Before that, in World War I, for example, if you wanted to protect your airspace, you had a bunch of airplanes flying in circles over what you wanted to protect. And when they ran out of gasoline as they went down and landed, another group of airplanes had to do it. It's called a combat air patrol. Well, imagine how inefficient it is if at any one time about 20% of your force is just flying in circles. And if they're almost out of gas and that's when the enemy comes, they're not going to be able to fight for very long. But if you have a bunch of airplanes on the airfield and they get called and they say, you ought to get up to altitude now, they get up to altitude just about the time the bad guys show up, then it's really easy to intercept them. So the British had a comprehensive system where the radar worked with the telephones, worked with the direction finding center where all the ladies used the telephone to call to the airfields to scramble the fighter planes and so forth. Same thing holds true for flak batteries. You could set up a bunch of flak batteries around a target you're likely going to be bombed, like say the city of Berlin, or better yet, the government buildings in downtown Berlin, and they can call up and say, hey, the planes are heading towards you. Now you can bring up your fighter planes, but you can also get all your cannons armed and ready. And ultimately, as the radar improved, they got good enough to also identify the altitude of the incoming planes. Now you have all kinds of information, so it's a lot easier to tell the fuse setters what they have to set, and they just wait until the planes are close enough, and now your fire is going to be a lot more effective. Again, technology layers working together as a comprehensive system. Now, the Germans didn't really realize at first in the war how important radar would be, and that feeds into some of the writing in America and Britain and Germany and so forth. And in America, the best known bomber pilot was Billy Mitchell, who you may have heard of. He commanded American airplanes during World War I, and in between the wars, he said, what we're going to have to do is in the future, if we fight trench war like we did in World War I, it gets very bloody, and you have lots and lots and lots of casualties, and it's really hard to break through the enemy lines. If you have airplanes, you can just fly over the battlefield and go straight to attack the cities, what he called the vital centers. That's where the politicians are, that's where the factories are, that's where the communications networks are, and so forth. If we just bomb the heck out of them, the people will tell their governments to stop fighting, and we'll end the wars. And it will be more humane by killing a bunch of civilians than it will be killing lots and lots of soldiers in the front lines. And if we have multi-engine bombers, they'll always get through because they can fly higher and faster than fighter planes. That was his fantasy. But he was very effective at selling said fantasy. There were a British man by the name of Trenchard said the same thing, an Italian by the name of Giulio Douhet said the same thing. Everybody thought that that would be the way things would work. When World War II began in 1939, the Germans tried that with Poland, and Poland was defeated on the ground so fast you didn't have to worry about bombing the cities much. So when they invaded France and the Netherlands and Belgium, they wanted to get the Netherlands to surrender quickly, so they bombed the city of Rotterdam at the same time as their troops were overrunning the frontier defenses. And again, Rotterdam surrendered very quickly. So what you see is that it looks like air superiority is going to work and the strategic bombardment will win the wars. The reality, however, is quite a bit different. When the Germans tried to do the same thing to the British, because they had an organized air defense system, some of Flak and some of fighter planes, the Germans took more and more casualties. So how do you choose what you're going to destroy? They tried to destroy airfields. Airfields are really hard to destroy, especially when there's lots of fighter planes in the air. So ultimately, the Germans got frustrated. Let's bomb London and Coventry and Dover and a bunch of other cities. But that's kind of bloody too, and it's difficult. And so let's fly at night when the enemy can't see us very easily, and then we can fly over them and destroy them. So very quickly, the Germans went to night bombing. Unfortunately, when you tend to blow people's homes up, for some reason they get kind of pissed off. And the thing that Mitchell and the other bomber barons never paid attention to or thought about is that there are lots of passive defenses, lots of ways in which the enemy can continue to thrive no matter if you bomb them, how you're bombing them. So what happened is, in the Blitz on London, lots of casualties were found, lots of people died, but the Germans had problems. Some days you couldn't bomb because the weather was bad. Sometimes you couldn't bomb because you couldn't find the targets. If the enemy flak was bad, you took a lot of casualties. That was hard on your morale. And you needed a lot more bombers to actually deal destruction than anybody ever figured. So the Blitz failed. Of course, as the war went on, when the British and the Americans started the counterattack, we went back to the whole idea of strategic bombardment. For the Americans in particular, the bombing campaign, the strategic bombing campaign, what was ultimately called Operation Point Blank, was the only way we could hit the Germans. So in one way, it was inevitable that that's what we were going to depend on. But the reality is it's very, very difficult to win that kind of a war. So let's talk about some of the passive defenses. And I have them just as one link, and I should probably have a whole bunch of links for it, but it gives you the idea. First thing is, think about the pictures you've seen of London during the Blitz or the ships on D-Day. You'll notice above all the ships, all these balloons floating. Those are what they call barrage balloons. They're all held onto their whatever's on the ground by steel cables. And the whole reason they exist is they're an obstacle. The planes, if they get too close, they're going to actually run into the wires, and the wire's going to screw up the propellers and maybe knock the airplanes out of the air. Also makes it hard to aim, because in order to get around the barrage balloons, you have to fly higher and higher and higher. The higher you are, the harder it is for the bombers to get the bombs to land on target. Things like different consistency of different levels of air, heat and things like that change the way the bombs drop. And even with the Norden bomb sight, things aren't nearly as accurate as they were predicted. In the first year of the war, American research showed that on average, for every ton of bombs dropped by the American bombers in the first year we were bombing Germany, 1.2% of those bombs fell within a mile of the target. Now, if it's 1.2% are falling within a mile, that means 98.8% are over a mile. The other problem with the idea of Mitchell and WWII and so forth was the thought, if you could just select the right targets, whether it be arms factories or railroad stations or whatever, if you destroy those factories, the enemy loses the ability to produce the goods and they'll have to surrender. Well, if you're bombing over a mile from the target, what kind of damage are you doing to the targets? Not much. So, barrage balloons. The other thing is, you can't bomb very easily if you can't see the target. So, if it's bad weather, you have to relocate to a different target. All right? Or the enemy can set up a whole bunch of smoke generators near the city, and as the bombers close in, you set off the smoke generator and the smoke gets in the way and you can't see your targets. Or at night, you use blackouts. Ever wonder why all the blackouts? If there's no lights coming from the city, it's really hard to navigate and know if you're right above the block of 38th and Main, which is where the factory is located, right? If you can't see it, you're going to drop bombs wherever you drop bombs, and it's not going to hit the targets that are really important. The British threw their hands up and said, that's fine, we'll just do area bombing and bomb the German cities. And, the Germans started this, so, if they lose some citizens, they lose some citizens. The Americans said, oh, we're never going to do that. But it's really hard to hit the targets when you can't find the targets. Especially when the Germans do things like, well, let's put up a bunch of poles in these fields outside the city and put lights on them. And at night, you'll have like 1 light out of 5 going. So as the planes come along, they see the lights. It must be a city. Let's go over here. The city's over here blacked out. The lights are here in an open field. There's a bombing run that's absolutely useless. Okay? Passive defenses. Other passive defenses. Decoys, that's what I was just talking about. Civil defense. Firemen, policemen, bomb shelters, air raid warnings, all of those things that move the populace to safe areas so that the bombs don't do much damage. At the end of World War II, the United States Army Air Corps had what they called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. And they looked at photographs and accounts from civilians and so forth. And what they found is it's really hard to destroy factories. Think about a factory. What do you have in a factory? Big concrete floor, big tall building, bunch of machine tools, an assembly line. Everybody goes into the bomb shelter. The explosives go off unless the bomb lands right on top of the equipment. Is it going to actually break one of those cutting tools? Is it going to destroy a drill press? No, you might have some fragments you have to clean up, and you might have to extra oil the machine, but it's fairly quick. And it turns out, one of the lessons in World War II is, say you bomb a factory and say you're actually on target. How much damage do you actually do? Not very much. How fast can they rebuild it? Oh, and by the way, since we're talking about the Germans, we also have slave labor. You kill 1,000 workers, what do? You pull 1,000 slave laborers from France or Italy or Russia or whatever and tell them to work for food. And if they don't work, you shoot them. And pretty soon they start doing the work. It's hard on the people, but if you're the German system, you don't care. All right? So even if you do destroy a lot of things, you still don't destroy the factories. And then how fast can the factories be rebuilt? What it turns out as, most of the evidence showed that you had to come back every couple of months and keep bombing the same cities over and over again to actually destroy the system. So you've got all of those as different ways of keeping the system going in spite of the flak defenses or the fighter planes or whatever. And so ultimately what happens is even the Americans get more and more frustrated and they start doing a lot more area bombing. If you destroy the housing for the workers, then they have to be shipped in. The time wasted when they're being shipped in is time when they're not producing things. If they're not sleeping properly, they're not doing work very effectively. If they're slave laborers, they may not be as quality driven as some of the workers might be, say, in the United States. So all of these are incremental ways in which you can affect the enemy. And the big part of the air story that Mitchell and Duhay and the rest did not understand is that success in a global war is incremental. You cannot have one battle or one killing or one bombing that actually changes the course of the war. It's incremental, and the only way to beat it is by an organized, comprehensive system. So you'll see that flak and anti-aircraft defenses are very holistic. So as part of that, and we'll talk about the technology again in a second, but I want to talk about politics in Germany for just a second. So as Hitler came to power, for a long time, his number 2 man was Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering had been a fighter pilot in World War I, in fact, an ace. He'd taken over the Red Baron squadron when the Red Baron was killed. He had a holistic approach to fighting the air war. Because he had political strength, he embraced the air as his area. Okay? In America, when you had flak defenses, they were part of what the Army did over ground troops, or what the Navy did at ocean, or Air Force defenses for airplanes, but they weren't integrated with the anti-aircraft guns. They were all separate operations. Hermann Goering said, well, since I'm in control of the air, all the pilots and everything that involves planes, bombers, fighters, everything else, part of my game, because it's in the air. Everything that protects you from the air, that is all the anti-aircraft forces, are within my command as well. So now we can coordinate our fighter planes with our defenses. And our parachutists, they're in the air, so they're part of my system as well. And so in Germany, the flak defenses, which were far more holistic and far more organized. Now, how does flak work? As you kind of got the feeling from my description in World War I, a lot of the flak defenses were what they called box barrages. You'd set up a series of batteries in front of what you figure is a big target, like say Berlin, or maybe the Krupp plants in the city of Essen or whatever. And you have a circle around the most likely air approach. And that's where you concentrate your guns. And then in front of that, you have more guns at a further distance. So as they fly towards you, you focus and focus and focus more, because you know when they get over the target, they have to fly straight to the target. They also have to fly close together, because the only way this bomber can protect this bomber is if you're close enough where their guns are firing at any fighter planes. So discipline of the bomber box is essential if the bombers want to survive against the fighters. They're all grouped together and they're all flying on a straight pattern right to the target we're looking at. That's you, sir, in the gray. And you are my target, and we are going to fly straight and direct to you. And there is not a damn thing we can do until the bomb run is over. And if you look at the technology of the Norden bomb sight, what it does is it's a calculator that's attached to the autopilot. When the pilot releases his controls and the bombardier starts focusing in on the Norden, it's actually controlling the plane, so it flies directly at you, and it has essentially a mechanical trigger that drops the bombs at exactly the point that the bombs will fall into the target. Theoretically, it was supposed to be very, very accurate. Unfortunately, it's not very accurate, because if the plane moves at all, the accuracy is off. And remember, we talked about it earlier, if the air currents are going up and down, and all these explosions, remember all the flak, the plane's going to do this, right? It's going to make the measurement off. And the other thing is, bombers tend to follow other bombers. If I'm the lead plane and I drop a bomb on my target and I miss by, say, 100 feet, other people are going to drop where my bomb is, and now they're suddenly getting a little further off because they're bombing off the wrong site. And then the 4th or 5th or 10th or 15th or 20th plane in the sequence is going to be even further off. So you have the bombs creeping away from the target instead of staying on the target. And again, you got all these guns firing at you. You have to get past the target and then turn around and come home. You can see that's a problem. That's a really dangerous sort of thing. Now, as the war went on, the rangefinders got better. You also had different kinds of fuses. So for example, we have a fuse here from a German 88mm cannon. It's got a percussion fuse, so if it actually hits a plane, it'll explode, but it also has a time fuse. So you can set it to explode at a certain amount of time, like we talked about earlier. It's really hard to be accurate with these. And as I said, in World War I, it was 5,000 rounds per plane? It gets a little bit more difficult in World War II. The average for 1943 and 1944 for a kill on American or British bombers, it took, in general, on average, 2,805 heavy flak rounds, 88 or bigger, and 5,354 light rounds, 20 millimeters, 37 millimeters, and so forth. Now, why the difference? Your 20 millimeters are for lower altitude, your 37 millimeters are for intermediate altitude, your 88s are for higher altitude. So, just as a way to look at it, when you look at the different guns, Let me get my statistics here right. The sheet, sorry about that. Your light guns fire up to about 4,000, that's the machine guns in the 20 millimeters, fire up to about 4,000 feet of altitude, and their rate of fire is around 250 to 300 rounds a minute. The 37 or 40 millimeter goes up to about 10,000 feet of altitude, and their rate of fire is about 120 to 140 rounds a minute, so half the rate of fire. When you get to the 88s, you're talking about 20 rounds per minute. You're talking altitudes up to about 28 to 30,000 feet. So what happens is, if the bombers come in low, they run into lots and lots of machine gun fire and lots of light flak. If they come in high, you have lots of explosions from the higher altitude guns. So are there ways to get around these defenses? Yes. One of the first things is, well, if they're shooting at us, let's go higher. The problem is, the higher we go, the more we miss our targets. So that's a problem. Another clever plan is, let's fly really low to get underneath radar so they can't coordinate with the radar. But if you're flying really low, then you're flying over all those cannons that are firing multiple 20 millimeter or 37/40 millimeter shells at you. So that doesn't work very well. You can also change your target by flying towards one thing and at the last time changing your target to a different city so that the defenses are going to be alerted here, not over here. But that's hard to do when the enemy's using radar. You can also do shuttle bombing. So for example, once we had landed in the Italian peninsula, we could fly from England to bomb a target in central Germany and then fly down to Italy. Well, why fly down to Italy? If the enemy airplanes, the fighter planes, and the flak guns are expecting you to go back to London, they're all waiting for you. And if you fly in the other direction, you can kind of miss some of those casualties. But that doesn't work nearly as well either as they want, because there are still heavy defenses elsewhere. So then they start introducing new technologies. One of the technologies is what was at the time called window, what we call chaff, which are short pieces of aluminum foil bundled together. And when you release them, they have the same image on a radar set as an airplane does. First time we did that was in 1943 when attacking the city of Hamburg. And the very first night it was used by the British. German records indicated that 5,000 airplanes were trying to bomb Hamburg because of all these defenses. So chaff does work. The problem is the Germans knew about it, and so they started coming up with solutions too. If you change the radar set so it uses a different wavelength, this doesn't have the same image. So what you do is you have two different radar sets with two different wavelengths, so your chaff isn't effective on both. It's only effective against one. So you now can compare the two. The other thing is, for every technological solution that the bad guys come up with, there is always a tactical solution. So there was a German fighter pilot by the name of Heil Hermann, but you don't need to remember his name. He came up with what he called the wild pig tactics. And what he would do is he would have a bunch of airplanes flying along the English Channel. And at night when the British came over, an airplane would follow the bomber stream just out of range of the bombers. And he would send all these messages every few minutes on the clear going, I am following a bomber stream at such and such a heading at such and such an altitude, and keep making those readings. It doesn't matter if you're trying to spoof the bad guys with chaff, if you've got this little tick stuck to your tail, right? No matter what you do, he's going to tell the defenders where you're going. So even though it might be dangerous for this guy, if he gets shot down, another plane takes it, and they follow all the way to and all the way back. So again, once you have one thing, it becomes a wizard war. The enemy is going to come up with solutions. The Americans also introduced what they called the G radar, where you'd have two radar sets setting beams out, and wherever they crossed would be the target for the day. And then the bomber streams would have radar sets that would read those. When the two beams crossed, they knew they were on target. So if you couldn't see it because of the smoke and so forth, you'd still be on target. Unfortunately, that was within 5 or 10 miles. So again, it wasn't accurate enough if you're trying to take out specific factories. So that's a problem. Another solution, technological solution, started by the British and finished by the Americans, was the creation of what's called the proximity fuse. This has a couple of ties in with Evansville, so it's worth talking about for a moment. One of the technological changes you get out of World War II is that radar sets become more common. They start miniaturizing them using microwaves. And if you get a radar set small enough, you could actually put it inside a fuse. The proximity fuse, or VT fuse, actually has a radio receiver on the inside of this. It is preset to a certain altitude or a certain distance. And as it's flying through the air, when it gets to that altitude, it goes off. Or when it gets within a certain distance of a radio wave, it'll go off. And you start firing this. Now, this whole part here is actually just a battery, an electric battery, so that you actually have power as you're in the air. The introduction of this, by the time we get to the last year of World War II, the VT fuses were used by the Americans and the British. The Germans never figured out how to use it, so they didn't have it. We did. The accuracy with this was such that you could actually get in the Pacific to 155 shells with a VT to shoot down an enemy airplane versus the 4,000 or 5,000 that we were talking about with just the time fuse. So you can see it's very effective. Now, what's the tie-in with Evansville? You'll notice that there is a plastic cone that covers the top of this. If you look in our display case for Hoosier Cardinal, we have one of these proximity fuses in the case, and you can actually look through the plastic because it's a clear plastic. That was part of the tech of the fuse that was made. Now, that being said, let's talk a little bit about production. Think about the precision involved in, well, this is as good an example as any. This is a very simple fuse, right? Think about how much machining you're going to need to do to have the primer fit within the screws of the projectile. It's a very complex piece. Now, pardon? Oh, good point. Absolutely wrong. So, here we have a set of screws that's actually going to fit the primer, and that's going to then fit into the shell case itself. Now, this is for a 40 millimeter Bofors, which is firing at about 120 to 140 rounds a minute. And you're going to have, for example, on an aircraft carrier, you're going to have about 80 of these, all firing at the bad guys when they're flying. So imagine what the ammunition consumption is going to be. In America, when the proximity fuse got created, they were actually contracted out to Chrysler, and they made the bodies and components for this using GE Electronics for the actual oscillator that sets off the fuse on this. During the last year and a half of the war, we made 20 million proximity fuses. 20 million. So think about how much goes into that kind of production, and think about what the cost is like. So that takes us kind of to the question of what constitutes victory for Flak and for the Americans both. So another way of saying how important was Flak. First thing is, Flak is important for the population. If you can't see the fighter planes because they're flying 3 counties over, they don't matter to you. What matters is when the bombers come over, the Flak is trying to stop them. It may not stop them, but you can hear the guns going off. You can see the searchlights and so forth. So there is a non-financial benefit for the populace that they feel like they're being protected. For the Germans and the Japanese both, Flak was also the last air defense standing. By the middle of 1944, by the time of the D-Day landings, the German Luftwaffe ceased to be a serious threat in the field, and it ceased to be a real threat against the American bombers. But this was still the only way the Germans had to strike back. So that is important. There's also a question. What is important? Destroying the airplanes that are flying overhead, or stopping the airplanes or making the airplanes ineffective. As the flak got better and better, planes flew higher and higher, the accuracy went off, so you had less real damage to the German industries. So in effect, whether or not you destroyed the planes, if you made it harder for them to do their job, you're actually defending the country better. Likewise, if the planes are flying overhead and you're damaging them but not destroying them, you are still hurting the enemy. So about 30% to 40% of the bombers that were damaged by flak were deadlined for 2 or 3 days or completely ineffective when they got home. So whether or not you destroyed 60 planes or 80 planes doesn't really matter. If 80 planes stopped flying, that's what the flak means. So all the planes that came back with damage were also planes that were not being effective. Now they may be used to cannibalize for parts and so forth, but it still reduces the enemy's strength. And of course, that means there's also a psychological impact. You'll see a lot of reference in World War II accounts and so forth to a lot of the pilots and aircrew who talked about being flak happy. By 1944, a pilot or aircrew had to fly 25 bombing missions over enemy territory before they could rotate home. And if you were having 2 to 5% casualties out of every bombing attack, what are the chances of surviving 25 missions when 20 says you're going to die or be captured? Imagine what it takes for the aircrew every day to get up and keep flying into that. And even for the ones that survived, imagine the psychological problems, what we now call PTSD, that comes from that. And what happens, of course, is the more flak happy the crews become, the less likely they are to stay straight and narrow onto the target, the less likely they are to be willing to take it to the last second to drop the bombs accurately. So there is an impact on the effectiveness of the bombing by the flak, even if they're not destroying the airplanes. Now, there's also a consequence for the flak country, whatever it was. In Germany, somewhere between 350,000 and 700,000 civilians died from bombing, depending on whose numbers you look at. Now, a lot of those were slave laborers too, but get to thinking about what impact that's going to have on the population. As the bombers went higher and higher and higher, more and more the bombers had to go to heavy use of area bombing. And it takes its highest toll when you look at Japan with the firebombing of the cities. There's no longer even the appearance of saying, oh, we're just going to hit strategic targets. The city is the target and the people are the target. Now, we can use lots of terminology to disguise what we're doing, but we're just trying to kill civilians. The British, they like using their terminology. So what the British did is they sent their bombers out to de-house the German workers. If you destroy all the housing, they can't come to work, right? It's kind of like the Germans talking about the final solutions. It's nothing really bad or mean, it's just people are accidentally dying, right? So that is one of the realities of flak. In terms of the U.S. bombing survey, approximately 61.44% of PTSD cases, or what they called combat neuroses, were due to flak or the effects of flak. So it certainly had a big impact on the pilots and aircrew, and it also cost the Germans hugely. If you follow tanks like I do, you'll find that the Germans never spent more than about 8 to 9% of their GNP on tanks, but about 40% of the German war effort went into the Luftwaffe, into the flak forces, into the airplanes. So think of 40% of Germany's industrial capacity was spent trying to protect Germany from the cost of the air campaign. So while the impact was huge on our crews, flak did impact us, but it didn't win the war. So with that, that's really what I wanted to talk about. Does anybody have any questions? If you have any questions, we're going to have a couple of microphones going through. Please raise your hands and we'll get a microphone to you in a minute.
Kevin,
Yes.
So when the German guns were firing the flak, how big was the flak box that was in the sky?
It depends on, that's a really good question. How big was the flak box? That is the area protected by the flak. It depends a lot on what the target was. So there were some targets like Berlin or the Romanian gas fields at Pleshki, where the box might be 20 miles deep and about 10 or 15 miles wide. In other places, especially tactically, it would be a lot smaller. So good question. Yes?
You were talking about doing the set timers for the thermometer. I assume that the timer is set and started at ignition then, or refrigerator, and you say the timer, you got fully equipped to do it, so it's fired off.
Good question. So for the fuse setters, they will actually go off when the shell is, or they will start the process when the shell is fired. Now in World War I, these were not mechanical. They actually had a little, for lack of a better word, a corkscrew of gunpowder. And what they would do is they would cut into that corkscrew. When the shell was fired, the flashing of the gunpowder would ignite that trail and it would burn for whatever the set amount of time is, and then the fuse would go off. But for the others, when they're fired, that's when the fuse starts.
And
Good
one,
question.
one additional question. Obviously, whatever goes up must come down. Is the volume of flak that goes up in the air, when it comes back down, is that
Does it impact the people below? Hell yes. So if you look at, for example, Pearl Harbor, we had roughly 2,400, 2,500 casualties that died at Pearl Harbor. We also had about 150 or 180, I don't remember the exact number, civilians that were killed mostly by flak falling out of the sky. Because when the air attack started, people weren't trained. They weren't used to civil defense procedures. And so all these fragments are falling out of the sky, just like the shell casings from the bullets and so forth. The shell casings fall out of the wings of the airplanes onto the ground. Well, if you've gone through your civil defense training, you know that when the alarm goes off, you go to the nearest shelter and you shelter yourself, or you go to your building, if nothing else, and allow it to take a lot of the pressure off you. People didn't know that, so they got killed. Other questions? Yes, over there in the corner. Yeah, that's you.
My dad flew B-17s over northern Italy and Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And in his flight log, he has one word description on flak. Light, heavy, or medium. And it's like, you look at that, you're screaming. What the heck? And I'm thinking he was one of the lucky that came back, obviously. I'm always amazed. I have a picture just like that in my family room of his plane and the flak around it.
Yes, and imagine
How did he live through that?
they're on the bomb run. They're over a city, I am sure, at this point. But look at that. It goes well below them and it goes above them. And it's a whole box you have to fly through. And this is just a small squadron. The other thing is, like I said, in order to stay alive from the fighter planes, the planes grouped together. If you ever wonder how exhausting it was for the pilots, too, the pilots, remember, the air makes the planes go up and down like that. Well, you have a squadron of 12 airplanes, and they're all flying close enough where that guy's machine guns can help cover my plane while I can cover his. If we get too spread out, we're easy targets for the bombers, or for the fighters. So you come in close like this, and they're already, you can see the tail end of one group and another group is straggling on that photograph.
You can see the diamond pattern in his plane. You can see his wing in another plane.
Right. Makes sense. Yes, you had a question there.
What do you call PTSD? What was called PTSD?
So during World War II, that was generally referred by psychologists as war neuroses. Neuroses in plural.
There's another word too besides that we use.
They also,
Shell shock.
shell shock was from World War I. You also had, later on, Section 8 was a person who had war neuroses. They also had sometimes combat exhaustion was used. They're all describing very similar issues, which is hyper-alertness, inability to sleep, alcoholism, et cetera, which are all aspects of individuals dealing with the stress of the threat.
But the shell shock, Section H, did that work pretty good in the military? You tried to get out of the military?
No, not really. The problem was World War II cost a whole lot more casualties than we ever expected. And so one of the things you'll find if you go into the psychology of soldiers is that the German defenses in Normandy were a lot more effective than we expected, and the fighting on the Siegfried Line was a lot more bloody than we wanted it to be. We started running out of infantrymen, so we started getting people out of supply lines and so forth and turning them into infantrymen. We had a lot of people who weren't prepared for that, and that's why you had the situation with Eddie Slovik, who's the last one who was executed for cowardice in the enemy. And it was really, if you read the account of what he was going through, a lot of what he was talking about was probably PTSD. So, and we're still struggling with how to deal with it today. We actually have at least the terminology to address it, and in World War II they didn't have it, and nor did they in World War I. The reason they call it shell shock is in both World War I and World War II, the vast bulk of the casualties were caused by artillery, like 60 to 80%, depending on which battle and which year. And you think about the concussion of the shells going off and the severe damage it does to the brain, and you can begin to see why shell shock is a really good name for it. Any other questions?
Thank you, Professor Reid.
Thank you very much for your attention, and hope you have a good day.
I want to remind you, in 2 weeks, Pete Blanc is going to talk about the Guadalcanal campaign. Thank you for coming.
Don't forget that the Indiana Military Museum has a really great collection of flak guns, so if you ever get a chance to get up to Vincennes to see them, I think you'll find it very useful. Thank you.